The bitter cold of the Montana winter night cut through Bethany Reed's threadbare shawl as she clutched her 3-month-old daughter against her chest, trying desperately to shield the infant from the merciless wind that howled through Timber Creek. It was 1878, and the young widow of 22 had nowhere to go. Her husband James, having been buried just 2 days prior after a mining accident, left her alone in this unforgiving frontier town with nothing but a baby and the clothes on their backs. The snow had begun falling in earnest an hour earlier, coating Bethany's dark hair with a layer of white as she stood outside the stagecoach office that had closed for the night. The ticket she'd purchased with her last coins would have taken them to her cousin's home in Denver, but the driver had announced the roads were impassable due to the storm. She'd been promised a refund in the morning, but that did her little good now as the temperature continued to drop, and her baby Emma's cries grew more insistent. "Please, just hold on, little one," Bethany whispered, her voice breaking as she fought back tears. "Someone will help us. They must." The main street of Timber Creek was nearly deserted, most sensible folks having retreated to the warmth of their homes or the local saloon. Bethany had tried the boarding house, but without money for a room, the stern-faced proprietress had turned her away despite the baby's cries. The church was locked tight, and she knew no one else in town well enough to ask for shelter. As Emma's wails grew stronger, Bethany felt her own strength waning. Her fingers were becoming numb, and a dangerous drowsiness was beginning to creep over her. She'd heard stories of people falling asleep in the snow, never to wake again. The thought terrified her as she forced herself to remain standing, gently bouncing Emma in her arms. The sound of hoofbeats cutting through the howling wind caught her attention. Through the swirling snow, a tall figure on horseback emerged, leading a second horse laden with supplies. The rider slowed as he approached, and Bethany felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. Strangers in the frontier could be saviors or dangers. There was no way to know. "Madam, are you all right?" The deep voice carried concern as the man dismounted, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the packed snow. He stepped closer, and in the dim light from the nearby saloon windows, she could make out a weathered face beneath the wide brim of his hat. He looked to be in his early 30s, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners as he frowned in concern. We have nowhere to go," Bethany admitted, her voice trembling from cold and exhaustion. "The stage won't run until the storm passes." The man's gaze shifted to the bundle in her arms as Emma let out another cry. Without hesitation, he unbuttoned his heavy leather duster and stepped forward. "Name's Rhett Jackson," he said, his voice gentle as he carefully wrapped his coat around both Bethany and her child, encompassing them in unexpected warmth. The coat smelled of leather, horses, and pine, earthy and reassuring as he pulled them against his broad chest, sheltering them from the wind with his body. "Ranch foreman at the Triple Oak, just outside of town. No woman and child should be out in this weather, madam." "Bethany Reed," she managed through chattering teeth. "And this is Emma, Mrs. Reed. I can't leave you two out here to freeze." His arm remained around her shoulders, steady and warm. "My cabin's not far, it's not much, but there's a warm stove and shelter from this storm." Under normal circumstances, Bethany would never have considered going home with a stranger. But these were not normal circumstances, and something in Rhett Jackson's eyes told her she could trust him. With Emma's life at stake and her own strength fading, she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Jackson." "I don't know how I'll repay your kindness." "No need for that," he said, leading her toward his horses. "And it's just Rhett." He helped her mount his second horse, making sure she and Emma were secure before handing her a wool blanket from his saddlebag. "Here, wrap this around both of you." It's about 4 miles to the ranch. The journey seemed endless as they rode through the blinding snow, Rhett leading the way with a lantern held aloft. He kept glancing back, checking that she was still following, occasionally pulling his horse alongside hers to make sure she and Emma were holding up. "Stay with me, Mrs. Reed," he encouraged when he noticed her starting to slump in the saddle. "Not much farther now." By the time they reached the small cabin nestled among pine trees at the edge of the Triple Oak Ranch property, Bethany was barely conscious, her grip on Emma weakening. Rhett tied the horses quickly and helped them down, practically carrying Bethany the last few steps to the door. The cabin was simple but tidy, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. Rhett immediately set to work building up the fire from the banked embers, adding logs until flames licked upward, casting the room in golden light and blessed heat. "Here," he said, guiding Bethany to a rocking chair near the fire. "Let me take care of the horses and I'll make some coffee to warm you from the inside." When he returned from the barn, stomping snow from his boots, Bethany had some color back in her cheeks and Emma had quieted, though the baby still whimpered occasionally. "She's hungry," Bethany explained softly. "I haven't been able to feed her properly today." Rhett nodded, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "I've got some milk from this morning. It's not fresh, but I can warm it, and there's bread and beans for you." As he heated milk in a small pot on the stove, Bethany took in her surroundings. The cabin was clearly a bachelor's home, functional and sparse, but surprisingly clean. A bed stood against one wall, a handmade quilt folded neatly across it. Shelves held a few books, and a desk in the corner was covered with papers that looked like ranch accounts. "Have you been at Triple Oak long?" she asked, trying to distract herself from her discomfort and embarrassment at her situation. "8 years, Rhett replied, testing the milk's temperature on his wrist before pouring some into a cup. "Started as just another hand, worked my way up to foreman 3 years back." He handed her the cup. "See if the little one will take this. It's not ideal, but it's better than nothing." Bethany thanked him and managed to coax Emma to drink from the cup, though most dribbled down her chin. Still, it seemed to satisfy her enough to stop crying. "And you, Mrs. Reed, you're not from around here, I take it?" Rhett asked as he stirred beans warming in a pot on the stove. "No, my husband James came for the mining work last spring. We were from Missouri originally." She swallowed hard. "He died in a cave 3 days ago. We'd been here less than a year." Rhett paused in his stirring, his expression softening with genuine sympathy. "I'm truly sorry for your loss, madam. Thank you. I was trying to reach my cousin in Denver, but—" She trailed off, looking down at Emma. "The storm got in the way," Rhett finished for her, serving her a plate of beans and breaking off a chunk of bread from a loaf. "Eat. You need your strength." Bethany hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was in front of her. She ate quickly, balancing Emma in one arm while Rhett sat across from her, nursing a cup of coffee. "You'll stay here tonight," he said, not a question but a statement of fact. "I'll take the chair. You and the little one can have the bed." "I couldn't possibly. You can and will," he said firmly, but with a gentle smile that softened his words. "I've slept in worse places than my own fireside, Mrs. Reed." That night, as Bethany lay under the warm quilt with Emma finally sleeping peacefully beside her, she studied Rhett's profile in the dying firelight. He sat in the rocking chair, his long legs stretched toward the hearth, hat pulled low over his eyes. She wondered what kind of man so readily opened his home to strangers in need, expecting nothing in return. Whatever kind he was, she was grateful he'd found them when he did. With that thought, she drifted into the first peaceful sleep she'd had since James died. Morning brought weak sunshine and a lull in the storm. Bethany woke to find Rhett already up and cooking breakfast, the smell of coffee and frying salt pork filling the small cabin. "Good morning," he greeted, tipping his hat slightly. "Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in days," she admitted, sitting up carefully to avoid waking Emma. "Thank you again, Mr. Jackson." "Rhett," he corrected with a small smile. "And it was no trouble. Looks like the storms let up some, but the pass to Denver will still be blocked. Might be a week or more before the stage runs again." The reality of her situation hit Bethany anew, a week with nowhere to go and no money for even a room at the boarding house. She must have looked as stricken as she felt, because Rhett set down the spatula and approached the bed. "Mrs. Reed, Bethany," he said carefully. I know it's not proper, but you're welcome to stay here until the road's clear. The ranch owner, Mr. Porter, is a good man. I'm sure he'd allow you to stay in one of the empty rooms at the main house if you'd be more comfortable there." Bethany considered his offer. The idea of imposing on this man's kindness for days on end made her uncomfortable, but she had few options. "I couldn't stay without earning my keep," she said finally. "I can cook, clean, mend. I'm not afraid of hard work." Rhett nodded thoughtfully. "As it happens, the ranch cook left last month. We've been taking turns in the kitchen, and none of us are much good at it. The men would probably be grateful for decent meals." And so began an arrangement that would change both their lives. Bethany and Emma moved into a small room in the main ranch house later that day, after Rhett spoke with Frank Porter, the aging ranch owner. The older man took one look at the young widow and her baby and immediately offered her a position as the ranch cook, with room and board included. "It's about time we had a woman's touch around here," Frank had said, his white mustache twitching with a smile. "And maybe some decent biscuits, too." The first weeks were a blur of activity as Bethany settled into her new role. The ranch hands 8 men of various ages who worked the 1,500 acres of the Triple Oak, were initially awkward around her but soon warmed up when they tasted her cooking. She established a routine, rising early to prepare breakfast before the men headed out for the day's work, then baking bread and preparing the evening meal while caring for Emma. Rhett kept a respectful distance, but Bethany often caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. He was unfailingly polite, tipping his hat whenever they passed and always asking after Emma's well-being. Sometimes in the evenings, when the other hands were playing cards or had ridden into town, he would sit at the kitchen table while she cleaned up, telling her stories about the ranch or asking about her life before Timber Creek. As February turned to March, and the first hints of spring began to appear in the melting snowdrifts and longer days, Bethany realized she was beginning to look forward to those quiet conversations. Rhett was unlike any man she'd known, thoughtful, steady, and surprisingly well-read for a cowboy. He'd been educated back east before the call of the frontier lured him west, and sometimes he would recite poetry he remembered from school, making her smile as she wiped down the counters. One evening in late March, as a gentle rain replaced the winter snows, Rhett came to the kitchen later than usual. Bethany had already put Emma to bed in the cradle one of the hands had built for her and was just finishing the dishes. "Thought you might have already turned in," Rhett said, removing his hat as he always did indoors. "Almost," she replied, drying her hands on her apron. "Would you like some coffee? There's still some warm on the stove." He nodded, and she poured him a cup, setting it on the table before taking the seat across from him. For a moment neither spoke, the only sound the gentle patter of rain on the roof. "The stage to Denver starts running regular again next week," Rhett said finally, his eyes on his coffee cup. "Porter mentioned it at dinner." "Oh." Bethany felt an unexpected twist in her stomach. Of course the roads would eventually clear. She had always planned to continue to Denver, hadn't she? Yet somehow in these weeks at Triple Oak the urgency of that plan had faded. "You planning on heading out?" Rhett asked, his voice carefully neutral. Bethany hesitated. I'm not sure anymore. Emma seems to be thriving here and Mr. Porter has been more than generous with the position." Rhett nodded slowly, a small smile forming. "The men would surely miss your cooking if you left." "Just my cooking." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and Bethany felt heat rise to her cheeks. Rhett's eyes met hers, serious now. "No, not just your cooking, Bethany." The way he said her name, soft and reverent, made her heart beat faster. It had been months since James died, and while she had mourned him sincerely, their marriage had been one of practicality more than passion. What she felt when Rhett looked at her like that it was something entirely new. "I was thinking," Rhett continued carefully, "that if you were considering staying, maybe we could. That is, I'd be honored if you'd allow me to court you properly. I know it's soon after your loss, and I'd understand if you—" "Yes," Bethany interrupted, surprising herself with her certainty. "I'd like that, Rhett." His smile then was like the sun breaking through clouds, transforming his normally serious face. "Well then," he said, reaching across the table to take her hand gently in his. "I reckon this calls for a proper outing. There's a social at the church in town this Saturday. Would you and Emma do me the honor of accompanying me?" The church social marked the beginning of their courtship, though in truth, it had started that snowy night when Rhett wrapped his coat around a desperate young mother and her child. Throughout that spring, as the Montana landscape transformed from white to green, their relationship blossomed just as steadily. Rhett proved to be as good with Emma as he was with horses, often carrying the now crawling baby on his shoulders as he showed Bethany around the ranch property. On Sundays, they would ride to church together. Bethany perched side saddle on a gentle mare Rhett had trained especially for her, with Emma secured in front of him on his stallion. The townspeople initially gossiped about the young widow and the ranch foreman, but their obvious care for each other and Rhett's respected position in the community soon quieted most wagging tongues. Besides, frontier life was hard enough without begrudging others their happiness. By early summer, Rhett had begun building a small house at the edge of the ranch property, working on it in the evenings and on his rare days off. Bethany pretended not to notice, not wanting to presume, but her heart swelled with hope each time she saw the structure taking shape against the backdrop of pine trees. On a warm evening in July, Rhett invited Bethany for a ride, asking Mrs. Porter to watch Emma for a few hours. He led her to a beautiful clearing overlooking a small lake, where he'd prepared a simple picnic. As they sat on a blanket watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson, Rhett took her hand. "Bethany," he began, his usually confident voice tinged with nervousness, "I never expected to find love out here. I figured my life would be the ranch, the cattle, maybe someday saving enough to buy my own small spread. But then I found you and Emma in that snowstorm and everything changed." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring with a single pearl set in gold. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I sent for it months ago, hoping someday I'd have the courage to ask you, Bethany Reed, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? I promise to love and protect you and Emma as long as there's breath in my body." Tears blurred Bethany's vision as she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When she found her voice, it was barely a whisper. "Yes, Rhett, yes, I will." They were married in the small white church in Timber Creek on the first day of September 1879, just over 7 months since that fateful snowy night. Emma, now toddling and chattering, was carried down the aisle by Frank Porter, who had become something of a grandfather figure to the little girl. Bethany wore a simple blue dress that Rhett insisted on buying from the mercantile, despite her protests about the expense. As she walked toward him, seeing the love and pride shining in his eyes, she knew with absolute certainty that this was where she was meant to be. The reception was held at the Triple Oak, with tables set up under the cottonwood trees and lanterns hanging from the branches. The ranch hands had outdone themselves preparing for the celebration, even constructing a small wooden dance floor where Rhett and Bethany shared their first dance as husband and wife. "Did I tell you," Rhett murmured as he held her close, "that the house is finished? We can move in whenever you're ready." "Tomorrow," Bethany suggested with a smile, and he laughed, the sound warming her from within. "Tomorrow it is, Mrs. Jackson." The little house became their home, filled with love and in time more children. The winter after they were married, Bethany gave birth to a son they named William, after Rhett's father. 2 years later came Sarah, a spirited girl with her father's eyes and her mother's determination. Emma grew into a beautiful young woman who never tired of hearing the story of how her mother and stepfather met, how a cowboy had wrapped a widow and her baby in his coat and his arms on a bitter cold night, an act of kindness that changed all their lives forever. Rhett eventually bought a partnership in the Triple Oak when Frank Porter decided to retire, and under his management, the ranch flourished. Bethany continued to cook for the hands until her own family demanded more of her time, then trained a young woman from town to take her place. Through the years, the hard winters and the bountiful summers, the cattle drives and the quiet evenings by the fire, their love only deepened. They faced the challenges of frontier life together. Drought years when the crops failed, the winter when William fell ill with fever and they feared they might lose him, the fire that destroyed the original ranch house, though thankfully not their own. Through it all, they found strength in each other. Rhett never lost his protective instinct toward Bethany and their children, and she never stopped being grateful for the man who had appeared out of a snowstorm like an answer to her desperate prayers. On their 20th anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their home watching their grandchildren play in the yard, Emma had married the local doctor's son and given them 2 beautiful granddaughters. Bethany turned to her husband, his hair now streaked with silver, but his eyes still as kind as the day they'd met. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't ridden into town that night?" she asked softly. Rhett took her hand, his thumb tracing over the simple gold band that had replaced her pearl engagement ring after he'd saved enough to buy it for their 5th anniversary. "I try not to," he admitted. "The thought of you and Emma out there in that cold, it still wakes me up sometimes." "God sent you to us," Bethany said with conviction. "I believe that with all my heart," Rhett smiled, bringing her hand to his lips. "Then I'm grateful he did, because finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me." Bethany Jackson. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Bethany leaned her head on her husband's shoulder, surrounded by the family and life they had built together from that one moment of compassion in a snowstorm. In the years that followed, the Triple Oak Ranch became one of the most successful in the territory, and the Jacksons were known throughout the region for their hospitality and generosity. Travelers in need never left their door hungry or cold, as Rhett and Bethany never forgot what it meant to be desperate and alone. When Timber Creek built its first proper school, Bethany volunteered to teach, passing on her love of reading to a new generation of frontier children. Rhett served on the town council, helping guide the growing community with the same steady hand he'd used to build their life together. Their children grew up strong and principled, with Emma becoming a nurse after studying back east, William taking over more of the ranch operations as Rhett grew older, and Sarah surprising everyone by becoming one of the first female journalists in the Montana Territory, writing stories about the changing frontier for newspapers as far away as Chicago. Through the turn of the century and into the early 1900s, as automobiles began to replace horses and electricity came to even remote ranches like theirs, Rhett and Bethany remained constants for each other, his arms still her safest haven, her love still his greatest treasure. And when visitors asked, as they sometimes did, how such a handsome couple had met, Rhett would always begin the story the same way. "It was the coldest night of the winter of '78, and I was just heading back to the ranch when I saw her standing there in the snow, holding that tiny baby, looking like she might blow away with the next gust of wind." Bethany would smile as he told it, remembering the feel of his coat wrapped around her shoulders, the strength of his arms as he pulled her against his chest, and the certainty that had grown in her heart over the years that some people are brought together by forces greater than chance, and some loves are simply meant to be.